see some familiar faces. Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlene Edwards. I'm the Director of Programs and Events for Project Unity, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our third segment of our Listen and Learn series. This is the last for this first series, and we'll pick up again in 2022. But we're so glad to have you join us tonight to listen and walk in the shoes of Captain Richard Stewart, who is actually my church member at St. Paul United Methodist Church. So it's good to see fellow church members on the call tonight as well. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge Pastor Richie Butler, who is founder of Project Unity. He is not able to join the call tonight, but he does send his greetings and welcome. And then also I do want to acknowledge Rob Crane, who is our Together We Dine ambassador and champion, former president of the Dallas Bar Association, and all things in support of Project Unity and our work in the community. So Rob, wave so everyone can see. There he is. So we definitely want to acknowledge them, and also some of our team members. Doris Edmond, I believe, is on the call for Project Unity as well. So without further delay, I want to introduce you to Captain Richard Stewart. Many of you know him, some of you don't. And tonight you're going to get an opportunity to walk in his shoes. And before I turn it over to him, I do want to acknowledge all of our service members, both active duty and retired. So if you'll just pop in the chat, if you are a service member or a retired member of the armed forces and what branch, we'd love to know that, acknowledge you, and thank you so much for your service, of what you've done, and what you continue to do for our well-being and safety. Okay, so Richard, without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlene. And I'd like to thank Charlene. She is the person that puts all of these events together. And I'd like to thank Pastor Richie Butler, who left St. Paul and is now at St. Luke Community Methodist Church. And I'd like to recognize Aunt Doris. I haven't seen her since prior to COVID, and somebody told me that you're still bossy, so I would expect nothing less. And I thank all my friends who've joined this. And Charlene told me that this is the biggest number of people to participate since this has started. This is not a speech, it's a talk. And I will just share some of the events of my life. I've been very fortunate. I've been married to Sandra King Stewart, Sandra Eubanks Stewart, for 40 years. We have two kids, James Tari, who's a graduate of Howard University, and he is the general manager of a Mazda dealership in Washington, D.C. We left the Washington area to move to San Diego, and he likes to say that we left him. We did leave him, but it was because he was in college. But he's remained in the DC area since that time. He has two kids, a daughter who's a graduate of Howard and a son who's a graduate of St. John's. They both are in the film business. We also have a daughter who is an I like to say actress, but she says actor. So she's an actor. She has been in a Broadway play. She's a graduate, a cum laude graduate of Spelman College. She currently is in New York, and she is getting ready to go on a road tour with a major production, and we'll be able to make an announcement regarding that after the first of the year. She also has a master's degree from George Washington University, and she worked for Georgetown University, assistant director of student governance for 8 years. My wife, Sandra, is a professional singer. She has a hit record that was on an album, Night Train in Nashville, Volume 2. It's Leave It Up to the Boys. as the information that you were provided indicated, I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana. Shreveport, Louisiana was very, very segregated. We had to ride on the back of the bus. We lived in a certain part of town. And I always say that at least in South Africa, they were honest in saying you have to have a card showing that you belong in a particular area. We didn't have to have a card, but we knew that if you treaded in areas where Black people shouldn't be, if you were not a maid or a gardener or performing some sort of low-level work, you should not be there. We had our own version of Bull Connor, a guy named George Dortoys, once when I was in high school, and we demonstrated. We were simply marching down the street. We were sprayed with tear gas. Our principal came out to try to get the students to turn around, and the police, under his direction, beat our principal up, and many of the kids ended up being hospitalized. One of the student leaders of the group ended up getting kicked out of school without any kind of due process. He ended up having to move to New Orleans to go to school. I didn't know he has now returned to Shreveport, and he's working there. I am the first college graduate in the Stewart family. I'm a graduate of Dillard University in New Orleans. I'm a graduate of Loyola University School of Law in New Orleans, and I have a LLM degree, an advanced law degree from George Washington University, or they like to say the George Washington University. My parents are the late Corrine E. and Richard G. Stewart Sr. And my father served in World War II. He served in Italy, and he served in Japan. He rode a troop transport from Italy to Japan, and he says that was a scary endeavor because that was when the Japanese were shooting torpedoes and they sank a lot of ships. But anyway, my father served honorably in the Army. He was discharged. He received an honorable discharge. And one of the things, as soon as he returned home, he went to New York because my mother was in New York working, and she heard he was home and she came back to Shreveport. And so they missed each other. But as soon as they got back together, they got married. I used to kid him, he didn't even have a job at the time that he got married, and he would just kind of grin. But anyway, one of the things that my parents had a dream. They wanted to have a family. They wanted to have a home. My dad wanted to be able to use his GI benefits to buy a home. And actually, he and some fellow members of the post office who were also veterans, they worked to start a subdivision. And this was during segregation. This was going to be an all-Black neighborhood, but it was in the vicinity of a white church. And the minister of the white church decided that this was too good a place for Negroes to live. And also it would be beneficial for the church to have white members there who would join the congregation. So the minister, along with the mayor and the police chief and some others, conspired together to not let this subdivision progress. In fact, they said that there would not be any public utilities, no sewage, no water, no gas, no electric provided to this subdivision if this was allowed to pursue. And all of the individuals involved were scared off, except my dad and a friend of his and a fellow businessman. And they filed a suit. My dad filed a lawsuit, Richard Stewart et al. And he was represented by Constant Baker Motley, and Thurgood Marshall was also involved. They lost the lawsuit. There were no fair housing laws at that time, but it certainly demonstrated the need for housing, for fair housing legislation. And all my dad wanted to do was do what all veterans should be able to do, is after you serve your obligation to be able to return home, raise a family, buy a home, work hard, and pay it off. And he was not able to do that. I was born in a hospital called Tri-State Hospital. And some years after I guess maybe when I was in elementary school, maybe junior high school, I learned that there was a brown house at the rear of the hospital. And that's where I was born. That's where all the colored babies were born, in the little brown house, not in the hospital. I used to work with a lady who is from Shreveport, and I used to tell her that. And she used to always say, I don't want to believe that, that can't be true. That can't happen in Shreveport. She's also the lady that came to my office one day and said, you should read this book, Help. It's just interesting, and I just can't believe things happen like that. And I told her that I knew about the Help. I didn't need to read it. My mother did domestic work, and I'm sure that she encountered many of the slights or discriminations that occurred in the Help. She had to ride the bus to work. She had to change buses right in front of a store in Shreveport or find women's clothes. She wouldn't shop there because they wouldn't allow Negro women to shop there, or they wouldn't allow Negro women to try on clothes, because the theory was that no respectful white woman would want to buy clothes that a Negro had tried on. Additionally, my father took us to Sears and to J.C. Penney's. We could try on clothes at J.C. Penney's and Sears. My mother typically had her clothes made. There were women in the community who sewed, and that's how a lot of Black women got their clothes, because they didn't want to suffer the indignities of going to stores where they couldn't try clothes on. Let's see. Another incident, when my dad first got married, we lived in the same house with my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, Wesley Stewart, Ollie Stewart. My grandfather was a Pullman porter. Negroes could not be conductors, but he was a Pullman porter. And my grandmother was a housewife, and she also did domestic work. And she also got clothes as hand-me-downs from the white individuals that she worked for. When I finished officer candidate school in Newport, Rhode Island, I came home in my uniform, and my grandfather saw me in my uniform. My grandfather had never seen a Black naval officer. He wanted me to wear my uniform every day while I was home, and I didn't want to do that, in part because just getting the uniforms cleaned and being ready to go on to my next duty assignment would be a challenge. But if I had it to do all over, and I've had time to think about it, I would. He was so proud. And my grandfather was not a person who had never been anywhere but Shreveport. He was a Pullman porter. So he traveled all over the United States. He had been to New York, he'd been to Chicago, he'd been to Los Angeles, he'd been to San Francisco, he'd been to Miami, he had been everywhere. He had seen Black Army officers, and maybe he had seen some Air Force officers, but he had never seen a Black naval officer. And that was not an uncommon experience. I remember when I transferred to I had a duty assignment in Nashville. I had a lot of people just come up to me and say, what kind of uniform is that? And I would say Navy, and they'd say, well, I've never seen a Black naval officer. One incident that's very memorable to me, one year when I was home on vacation from college, my grandmother asked me to go to Dr. Harris to pick up a prescription. Dr. Harris was the physician who delivered me. He also delivered my brothers, Carl and James, and he had been my grandmother's physician for a lifetime. And when I went to his office, and this was maybe like 1966, 67, maybe even 68, his office had two doors, one for colored, one for white. And I said, well, I'm not going to go in the colored door. So I went in the white door, and they just said, well, if you want your grandmother's prescription, you got to go back out the white door and come in the colored door. And I did not want to do it. I loved my grandmother, and I knew she needed the prescription. So I went back out, and I went back in the colored door. And I just mentioned my brothers. I have two brothers. One is Carl E. Stewart. He is a judge on the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Carl is the immediate past chief judge of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. He was the first African-American to serve on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. He has been a state appellate judge. He was a trial court judge. He was a assistant U.S. attorney, and he was in private practice. My youngest brother, or baby brother, as we like to call him, James E. Stewart, is the district attorney in Caddo Parish. And that's also a first. James is a former state appellate judge. He is a former district court judge. He was a former first assistant U.S. City attorney. We all graduated from Loyola School of Law. And I also have a niece, Coretta Stewart, Carl's daughter, who is a graduate of Loyola. My wife likes to say that we have too many lawyers in the family. Let's see. And I'd like to share another incident with my maternal grandparents. My mother was from Minden, Louisiana, and I used to go and visit my grandparents. They had a farm, and it was about 30 miles from Shreveport. And typically, my mother and father would take me. My mother and father had they drove me to Minden, but when it was time to come back, I was going to ride the bus. We usually ride the bus, or we would ride the train. So my grandfather dropped us off while he went to park the car. And in the bus station, they had two Coke machines. One was new, and the other was old and raggedy. The new one was for white. The old one was for color. And I was a little kid. It didn't make sense to me that there was a new Coke machine and an old Coke machine, and I had to get the Coke machine. Get a Coke out of the old machine. So my grandmother gave me a nickel, and that just tells you how long ago that was. You could buy a Coke for a nickel. And she said, make sure you get a Coke out of the old machine. When she turned her head, I put my money in the new machine and got a Coke. And I could just see the fear on her face. And I immediately knew that I had done something wrong. And I also recognized that if somebody had seen me, there's no telling how much what my grandmother would have to do to get us out of that situation. But it's just amazing that just simply something like buying a Coke, one would be prohibited from simply buying a Coke. I also just like to mention that people often ask me when they find out I'm from Louisiana if I attended LSU. I did not. LSU was segregated. University of Texas was segregated at that time. One of my contemporaries was Terry Bradshaw. Terry attended the white school, Woodlawn. I attended Booker T. Washington. I was very fortunate that I was able to, I have one other story I'd like to tell. My dad had a series of jobs, but for the most of his life, he was a letter carrier in the same neighborhood. This was before postmen were able to drive up and stick mail in the mailbox. So for a greater part of his career, he walked his route. But on the weekends, he worked overtime. He would drive a mail truck. And that was when, you could mail something on the weekend and you could get it picked up because they had regular delivery. So he was driving in Bossier City. Bossier City is just right across the river from Shreveport. And the police stopped him and gave him a ticket for speeding. Well, one of the problems with receiving a ticket was that the truck had what's called a governor. And that's a device that prohibits or precludes a vehicle from traveling above a certain speed. And I don't know exactly what the speed, what they charged him with, but for example, they gave him a ticket for driving 60 miles and the vehicle would only go 40 miles. So when he got the ticket, he went back to his boss and told his boss about it. And they had the vehicle checked and the governor was still in place and it was still working properly. And so they went to the sheriff's department, and I never saw the sheriff, but I envisioned it was somebody like Rod Steiger in the heat of the night. And he just refused to accept the word of the post office that the vehicle had a governor and it couldn't go as fast as the ticket was. And so they couldn't get him to dismiss the ticket. So the post office brought in somebody from Washington, D.C. They looked at the truck and they just confirmed what had already been laid out, that the truck could not go 60 miles as he had been ticketed. So eventually the ticket was dropped, but the sheriff was mad and inferred that if my dad, if they ever caught him driving in Bossier City, he would get a ticket. So obviously they had to assign him to other locations and not send him to Bossier City. Let's see. And I was given an outline for suggestions as how to talk about what it's like being in the Navy. What's the life like being a military officer? And as how did I end up joining the Navy? I was in my first year of law school, and I had college deferments up to that time. And that was when the lottery came out. When the lottery came out, I had a low lottery number, as did my brother Carl. And I received a draft notice. And so I went, at the time, it was the heat of the Vietnam War. People were being drafted. They were going into the Army and they were going to the Marine. As a matter of fact, in talking to some of my friends, they would just say, count off, and all the even numbers would go in the Army and go to the infantry, and all the odd numbers would go to the Marines. And so I wanted to have some other options. Being an infantry person was not something that was on my list of things that I wanted to do. So I went around to the various recruiters, and I had already taken the test to go to officers candidate school while I was in college, just in anticipation that this day might come. As I was walking down the hall to the Navy recruiter, I had to pass the Marine recruiter's office. The Marine recruiter said, "Come in, boy, we'll make a man out of you." And at the time, I think I was about 21 years old, and I told him that I was already a man. I didn't need the Marines to make me a man. So I went into the Navy recruiter's office, and they said it looked like I qualified for officer candidate school, but because I had the draft notice, I needed to do something immediately. So I enlisted in the Navy and applied for officer candidate school at the same time. And off I went to Orlando, Florida to boot camp. At that time, the Navy had 3 boot camps: Orlando, San Diego, and Great Lakes. Now they only have 1, Great Lakes. I went to boot camp partially in the winter. I would not have wanted to go to Great Lakes. But anyway, I was appointed recruit chief petty officer in my company, which is the the recruit that's in charge. And we were the honor company, and I was selected as the honor graduate from my company. Halfway through boot camp, they called me out of formation and told me to go talk to the chief. Chief said, "I have good news for you, Stewart." And he said, "I have good and bad news for you." He said, "You've been selected for OCS, but you're going to have to finish boot camp." One event in boot camp that I will never forget is part of training. We had to go for physicals, and we had a lot of medical exams. We had to go to the dentist. One day we had a presentation by a dentist, and he was a commander, and I was a seaman recruit. When he began his presentation, he said, "If you have dark gums, you have gum disease." And I just could not believe that with all the African-American sailors sitting in the office, that he would just leave that statement as it was. So during his presentation, I stared at him, and he saw me staring at him. And he would look in my direction occasionally, and then he would stare away. And he finished his presentation. He had a seat, and then he got back up, and he said, "I would like to make one correction to my presentation. If you have dark skin, having dark gums is normal." And so that was something that I felt like that even though I was a seaman recruit, I made this guy realize that he had just ignored all of the Black sailors in the office and the Hispanic sailors, and he corrected it. I went to one of the things that I was asked in the presentation was about mentors, and were there any whites who were of great assistance in advancing my career. And when I went to OCS, my roommate was Steve Juergens. Steve's a really great guy. A few years ago, I received the Dallas Bar Martin Luther King Award. Steve came down for that. We've maintained contact since we were in boot camp in officers candidate school in 1971. He was a great roommate and was great of assistance. While I was in boot camp, one of the courses that I had was navigation. And navigation was somewhat of a challenge. We had to do like they did in days of old, go on the bridge of a ship, shoot stars, and find a position as if we were out in the middle of the ocean. And all it took is like one decimal point being off, and your navigation fix would be wrong. So there was a guy named Merritt. I remember he was from Minnesota, and really smart guy, never studied, always made the top grades. One night he knocked on my door and he said, "Stewart, mind if I tell you something?" I said, "No." He said, "Give me your navigation book." He said, "You are trying too hard." He said, "See all of this?" He pointed to some pages. He said, "Forget about that. Just remember the things on this page and you'll be fine." And I followed his advice, and I never had any trouble with navigation thereafter. And, this is a guy, he was in my company, and he just volunteered. And I would say that all of the people in my company were very good and very supportive. I would also note that I share the same birthday and year with David Eisenhower, the grandson of President Dwight Eisenhower, as well as Al Gore. And David Eisenhower was in OCS the same time I was. He was ahead of me, and Al Gore ended up going in the Army, and he served in Vietnam. And I would just note that because I know of some other sons of high-level officials who had low draft numbers, and through some way, some form of fashion, managed to dodge their obligation to serve. And that was one of the issues that was raised during this time, is that too many disadvantaged, too many people without influence ended up having to go and serve our country. And even worse, in situations like my dad, where he went and served in 2 locations and he came home and he wasn't able to utilize his GI Bill like others. And in my case, when I came back from Vietnam, I had a bag full of checks because we were operating in the Gulf of Tonkin and there was nowhere to spend the money. And that was when we actually got paid in checks, not direct deposit. And so I went to Bank of America in Los Angeles when I got back and I wanted to cash my checks. And Bank of America refused to cash my checks. I was in uniform, I had government checks, I had my government ID, and they said, well, that's more money than you have in your account. Why don't you deposit the money in your account? And I said, I don't want to deposit it in my account. I want to cash it. I have some things I want to do with the money. And so this was in a neighborhood that had a large Black representation, and people could overhear what was going on. And the Blacks and the white just really got irate because they would not cash my check. And finally, the manager came out. We explained what was happening, and he was, well, you see, Mr. Stewart, and I said, Lieutenant Stewart, we have a policy, and if you'll just put the money in the bank. And I said, no, just close my account, give me all my money, and he cashed the checks. But so that's one instance that I had. My first duty assignment was to the USS New Orleans. The USS New Orleans was a helicopter carrier. I was the first Black officer to be assigned to the USS New Orleans. And at that time, there were not a lot of Black officers in the Navy. I was pretty well received when I went on to New Orleans. However, there was one individual that I was working for initially who was not a good person to work for. He was, I think of he was just not a good person. And going back to, were there any whites who helped advance my career? I have a good friend, Jack Mayberry. Jack Mayberry is a retired captain. At the time, Jack was a lieutenant junior grade and I was an ensign. And Jack persuaded me to come work for him. His boss was getting out of the Navy. And even though he was a JG, the captain was going to let him assume a lieutenant's position. And he talked to the captain and persuaded the captain to allow me to move to his job, which was a lieutenant JG position, and I was an ensign. At the time, I didn't realize it, but thereafter, I realized that Jack saved me. He got me out of harm's way. It would have been very damning if I had continued to work for the individual that I was originally assigned to work for. While I was on the New Orleans, or actually shortly after I joined the Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations was Admiral Elmo Zumwalt. The Chief of Naval Operations is the top admiral in the Navy. And so Admiral Zumwalt started making changes. He started making the Navy a better place for Black officers. And so one of the things that he did was he ordered Black officers to be assigned to recruiting, Navy recruiting. And so I received orders to Navy Recruiting District, Nashville, Tennessee. My captain was not happy about that. He did not want me to go. And he said, and I think he was frank about it, he said, if you're going to have a Navy career, you're better staying on the ship. And in fact, I had been the first officer of the deck that he qualified when he came aboard. And that's, if you're going to be a line officer, and the line officers are the people who are in charge of ships, staying at sea and getting your qualifications is what you need to do. And being one of the first qualified, he was going to lose an officer. And so he sent a message back to Washington saying, I don't think this is a good idea for Ensign Stewart, and he needs to stay here. And I was the assistant communications officer. So I guess he thought that he was sending these messages back in secret, but because I was a communications officer, I knew about all the communications. And the Bureau of Naval Personnel sent him back and said, send send Ensign Stewart to Nashville. We need him. And so I left to New Orleans and I went to Nashville. And then while I was there, I was waiting to get out of the Navy. I was finishing up my 4 years in the Navy, and I guess I was selected for what's called the law education program. It was the first time program. I think there were 14 people selected, and I was one of the 4. And so I was able to go back to Loyola and finish up law school. And that's when I met my good friend, I think then he was Lieutenant Commander Morris Siner. And Morris, we were lifelong friends, and Morris sent me to my first duty station as a JAG officer, and that was at the Naval Legal Service office in Memphis. Talk about an interesting experience. In my opinion, we had 2 of the worst naval officers in the Navy in Memphis, and they had never had a black officer work for them, and they were intimidated by my presence. The executive officer told me that he was going to put me in legal assistance, and typically all new officers went to be a defense counsel to get into court. Everybody wanted to go in the courtroom, and I couldn't understand why he wanted me to go to legal assistance, but I was pretty adamant, and finally he backed off, and he said, okay, you can go and be in legal, you can go in the courtroom. Well, a little later, and at that time, there were probably even fewer female JAG officers than black officers. We had a female coming, and so one day we were having an officers meeting, and he told us about the female that was coming, and he said, I'm going to put her in legal assistance. And so one of my colleagues said, why are you going to put her in legal assistance? And he said, because everybody who comes goes in the courtroom first. And the executive officer said, she's a woman. I don't trust them. I want to put her in legal assistance so I can watch her. So I found out why he wanted to put me in legal assistance. In addition to that, he was an alcoholic. He used to have a white cup. Every day he would go out to his car and fill it up with vodka, and he'd come back. And he also he had a party at his house, and he invited everybody. And at the time I was single, I brought a date. When my date walked in, he asked her, do you work? Now, why would you ask someone, do you work? Unless you believe that all blacks are on welfare and they don't work. My commanding officer was also a very interesting person. When Martin Luther King's holiday came up, he called me in his office and he said, Stewart, you can go to the Martin Luther King ceremony. And we had one black enlisted, and you can take, I don't recall the guy's name, but you can't tell his boss that he's going, and you can't tell anybody. You got to keep it a secret. So I just said to myself, how am I going to go and take a guy who works from somebody else and just take him and not tell anybody? And then an even more interesting incident happened. As most of you probably know, Memphis has Arkansas on the west and Mississippi on the south. When you drive out of Memphis, you're literally in Mississippi. Every year, there was an all-white organization that would have a cotillion, and they would always ask for some junior naval officers to be escorts. And so the captain called me in And there were only two bachelors, another Lieutenant Dwayne Benton. He's now an appellate judge, real smart, really nice guy. And he proceeded to tell me he wanted me to know and wanted me to not be offended by the fact that they had asked for some junior officers and they only wanted white officers. They didn't want any black officers. And I understood that this was the South and this was in Memphis. And he wanted to make sure I wouldn't be offended. And I said, well, Captain, I'm not offended. I mean, I'm sure that they understood when you told them that the Navy was non-discriminatory and that we couldn't participate in such an event. And he lost his breath. I thought he was going to pass out. He didn't expect that response, but it put him in a position where he couldn't respond. He couldn't send my colleague, and he couldn't. So he was at a loss. But anyway, that just kind of tells you the kind of individuals that they were. But one good thing happened to me, other than leaving when I was at Nelson, Memphis, is the Deputy Judge Advocate General of the Navy, Admiral John Jenkins, a man who was very instrumental in my career, and he was white. Going back to, have there been any whites instrumental in advancing my career? And I always say that a mentor is a mentor, and it doesn't matter whether it's somebody black or white. And there were not any blacks ahead of me in a position to be mentors in the first place. But in any event, my commanding officer, I had a new commanding officer, said, you should go see Admiral Jenkins. And I was like, why should I go see Admiral Jenkins? But I did. And first thing Admiral Jenkins asked me was, have you ever thought about being a detailer? In the Navy, detailers or assignment officers are the people who tell people where to go. They plan your assignments and they help or hurt depending on the individual's perspective with your career. Two ways to destroy a career is to give an officer a bad evaluation, or to send them to the wrong duty station, send them somewhere that's it's either a bad assignment or it's just somewhere that they can't handle the assignment. But anyway, I talked to Admiral Jenkins. He said, you should consider being a detailer. And my thought was, well, being a detailer is not practicing law. So I'm not interested in going, but I can't tell this man that I'm not interested. So I said yes. So when I left Memphis, I went to Naval Air Station, Alameda, California. And one day I received a call from Admiral Jenkins' assistant. And Admiral Jenkins, he said, do you remember meeting Admiral Jenkins when you were in Memphis? And I said, of course. And he said, well, Admiral Jenkins wants you to come to Washington to be a detailer. And I said, yes, I'm interested. That is probably the greatest thing that ever happened to me. That helped to make my Navy career, because the office of the Judge Advocate General, you learn how things operate. You get to meet a lot of people. You get to serve as a recorder on selection board. You get to listen at the foot or at the feet of the people who are making all the decisions. So I just really learned a lot. But not only that, you get to assign yourself to your next duty station. And my next duty station was to go to postgraduate school at George Washington University. The Navy has an excellent postgraduate program. My colleague, Robin Blackwood, went to postgraduate school, and my colleague, Morris Siner, they both, we all went to postgraduate school. And it's Admiral Jenkins used to call it a year in reflection. He had a year off to go to school, and the Navy was paying your way. So that was very good. And from that assignment, because of my recruiting background, and we were having some issues in recruiting, the JAG asked me to go to Navy Recruiting Command. I worked for two great admirals, and that was the first time. And One of the things you want to have while you're in the Navy is you want to have assignments of increasing responsibility. I had worked for a captain at Alameda, and so this was going to work for a 2-star. Admiral Colley was a submariner, very smart guy, ironclad memory. It was just really great working for him. One of the interesting experiences that I had when I worked for Admiral Colley was he had a chief of staff who was a gate guard, and he controlled the comings and goings, and he wanted you to tell him what you were going to talk to the admiral about and all of that. And so I had a case, and there was an officer who had committed some misconduct, and I had a recommendation for the admiral. And his chief of staff, I asked to get an appointment. He wanted to know what I was going to tell the admiral. And he said, the admiral's busy, and maybe a couple of weeks before I can get you to see him. And I was new on the job, and I just said, well, if this is the circumstances I'm going to have to operate under, I won't be able to do my job. So fortunately, my office was across the hall from what in the Navy we call the head. And so I put my staff on alert, and I said, when the admiral goes to the head, let me know. And so when he went to the head, I went in and I talked to him, and I told him what I needed to take care of. And he said, fine. And so I never said anything else to his gate guard. And one day he stopped me and he said, do you still need to see the admiral? And I said, no, I saw him, and that's a done deal. And he said, when did you see the admiral? And I said, well, I saw him, don't worry about it. And you're not supposed to see the admiral. I said, well, I saw him and I took care of business. And so I never had any trouble getting in to see the admiral after that. His successor was Admiral Hank McKinney. Admiral Colley was a Naval Academy graduate. Admiral McKinney was a graduate of Princeton, another smart guy. He was a submariner. I used to play him racquetball, and I used to beat him up. He used to give me grief about that. But two things I will say about him. I'll say three things about him. First of all, when I met him, he said, I hate lawyers. When I left, he said, I said I hate lawyers, but after meeting Richard Stewart and having him work for me, I love lawyers. Or at least I love one. I like one lawyer. And also, Admiral McKinney created a budget for me to do recruiting. And that's something that had never happened. And I don't think it's ever happened since I retired. I've been retired 27 years. He gave me my own budget. We were having some issues trying to recruit minority officers, and money was one of the obstacles to being able to go around to the various events. So I was able to go to law schools. And actually, I did some other recruiting, but this man who hated lawyers created this budget for me. And I want to go back to when I was working in the Office of the Judge Advocate General. One of my colleagues was Tom Morrison. Tom Morrison is retired. Tom Morrison was the accessions recruiter. He had the same job that Morrisana had. And Tom was just pulling his hair out because he was having trouble recruiting minority attorneys. And he called me in one day and said, Richard, I need your help. And one of the problems is that every officer who came in the JAG Corps had to be interviewed by a JAG officer. And frequently, people where there were no active duty JAG officers were assigned, they were interviewed by guys who had left active duty or reserves. Sometimes the quality of the individual doing the interview should be questioned, could be questionable. Tom had one guy that he thought was outstanding. He got a lukewarm interview from a JAG officer, and the guy lived in Maryland. So Tom said, hey, would you interview this guy? So I interviewed him. He was outstanding. And so I wrote up an interview, and he got accepted, and he's now a retired captain, had an outstanding career. And we figured out ways to interview people, even we didn't have any money. I'm getting notes from my wife, but anyway, we figured out a way to recruit people, and so we were very successful. We recruited a lot of different additional people, and also Tom was very helpful. The Office of the Judge Advocate General was a pressure cooker. Long hours, traffic to work, traffic home, had to drop my daughter off at daycare, just a lot of problems. And there were some bad days when Tom would walk in and just say, give me some advice and tell me how to deal with it. And he saved my career. And there was another individual who's now deceased, Mike Gregory. Mike Gregory was white. Mike Gregory was a homosexual. Mike Gregory was open and notorious. But Mike saved my career when I was in the Office of the Judge Advocate General. Mike, if he liked you, he would help you. If he didn't like you, he would go out his way not to help you. We had all kinds of reports. We had all kinds of memos. We had all kinds of things that we had to do. And there was just not enough time or energy to accomplish it all. Fortunately, we had a dictating system in the office, and you could call and do dictation from afar. And at night, I used to dictate memos and letters and all kinds of things. And when I would get to work the next morning, they would all be finalized, and all I had to do was sign them. Now, Mike Gregory was the kind of guy that if he didn't like you, he would not do those things for you. And I'd like to go back to the New Orleans and raise another point. The New Orleans was a ship that transported Marines. So we had Marine pilots, we had the grunts, the ground pounders, guys who ran around in the mud. There was, and officers were supported by stewards. And at that time, they were all Philippine. Prior to that, they had been all Black. Well, they picked up our laundry, and there was a Marine major who was just really mean. He was very demeaning to the stewards. And so one day when they picked up his laundry, he had a top secret message in his shirt pocket. Well, typically they would call you and say, you need to come and get your laundry, and there's something you need to take out of it. But for this guy, they turned him in. They turned in the top secret message. I never found out what happened to him, but he was gone the next day. Let's see. Let's see. From Navy Recruiting Command, I went to Naval Legal Service Office, Corpus Christi, and there I had the distinction of being the first African-American naval officer to command a Naval Legal Service Office, and there is where Commander Robin Blackwood came into my life. Actually, she came into my life prior to that. She's married to retired Captain Steve Wilson, and Steve Wilson was going to Corpus Christi to be the wing commander. And Robin wanted to go to an assignment in Corpus Christi so that she could accompany her husband. And if memory serves me right, Robin at the time was a lieutenant commander, and the job in Corpus Christi was for a commander. And she was concerned that she couldn't go to the job because she was only a lieutenant commander. Robin had an outstanding record, one of the best naval officers that I've ever known. And so it was not a challenge to send her to the assignment in Corpus Christi. Little did I know that later on I would go to be the commanding officer. And so a lot of people complimented me. They said, "Hey, you really set yourself up by detailing Robin Blackwood to Corpus Christi." And it was not something that I did this by design. It was just something that by happenstance. But Robin was a great person. She ran a tight ship. Uh, I really didn't have a job when she was there because she took everything. I mean, she took care of everything. Just a very outstanding person. And there are a lot of commands in Corpus Christi. Most of them are aviation related. My predecessor didn't like to get out. We provided legal services for the base for the entire state of Texas, and I was commanding officer during Operation Desert Storm, and so we had a tough workload. And Robin and Steve made sure that we were involved in all of the activities. The statute of the Naval Legal Service Office and its commanding officer roles during my tenure. And, I give myself some credit for that, but Robin and Steve really opened a lot of doors and paved the way. And when Robin was the XO, I just never had any problems. Any problems that came up were resolved before they ever got to my attention. And so I can never thank her enough. She has just truly been a friend, and she's a great naval officer. And I was very fortunate to meet her. And I appreciate the people who think that I set myself up. I didn't. Let's see. How am I doing on time, Charlie? You're on mute.
Oops, there we go. So at this time, we do need to transition to Q&A. So we want to, if you would just kind of wrap up with a thought about your career to share, and then we'll open the chat for a couple of questions before we start to have people to transition off.
Okay, a couple of things I want to say is I had a great naval career, and I'm glad that there are several people on that I could just recognize them for the support that they gave me. I know at the current time we have the issue with the virus, and I just like to point out that when we were growing up, polio was an issue, and we all got vaccinations. And I know people who didn't get the vaccination who are suffering from the problems with not getting the polio vaccine. And I would also like to just point out that my parents had a dream, just like Dr. Martin Luther King, and their dream was simply that their kids and their grandkids would have an opportunity to be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin, be able to work hard and be able to avail themselves of all the amenities that go along with that. And they also encourage us not to be afraid to venture forward to places that there are no Blacks. My brother Carl was the second Black judge in Shreveport. As I indicated, my brother James is the first Black DA. When my brother Carl ran for judge the first time, his opponent went fishing, and they couldn't find him to tell him that he had lost the election. He was so confident that running against someone Black that he would just be a shoo-in. So I would just say that I've had a great life. I have lots of friends. I have lots of good friends. I have lots of good white friends. I have Filipino friends. I have friends. And I have a lot of lifelong friends. And one person that I didn't mention is Bill Miller. Bill Miller is, we served together at my first duty station. Bill's retired JAG officer. He was in our wedding. He was a ring bearer in our wedding. So just a really great guy. And I've just had so many people who've been supportive, who go out of their way to do anything to be helpful. And I sincerely appreciate that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing your story. This is just amazing to hear. And we appreciate you opening yourself up and being vulnerable to share your story and allowing us all to walk in your shoes. We'll take a couple minutes if you all can hang with us. If anyone has any questions to pop in the chat, we'll take one or two questions.
Before we get questions, let me just, there's one other point I want to make. I tinted windows, in my opinion, are a godsend, harder to racially profile. I've been racially profiled a lot of times, but one time in particular, I went to visit some classmates in the Washington, D.C. area. Police stopped us. I was sitting in the back of a Camaro. They jerked me out of the car. It had been raining. They threw me in the mud. My friend was driving. They pulled him out and they threw him in the mud. And then they took his wife out and they said, "Are you okay?" And she was screaming and she said, "Look what you've done to our best friend and my husband." It turned out that we fit the description, 2 Black men and a female. And my friend's wife was fair skinned, so they thought she was white. But anyway, when they stopped us, they had already caught the individuals that they were looking for. And, all they did was say was sorry. So that's something that I just wanted to share with you, because some people like to say, well, if you're good and you do what you're supposed to, things like that will never happen to you. And I just say that's not true. We just had a situation where an individual lost his life because somebody thought that he shouldn't have been there because of the color of his skin. And that's just, when I was growing up, the one thing that I hoped that when I became an adult and had kids, that I would not have to have a talk with my kids and say, you got to be careful, because just because of the color of your skin, somebody might do harm to you.
Yep, very true. Very true. Thank you for squeezing that in.
I'm ready.
All right. If you have a quick question, please pop it in the chat. And if you all can just hang with us, it's just an amazing journey. And to be able to listen and glimpse into his life. Any questions?
I have a question and a comment.
Okay. And you
Yes.
chose iPhone. Your name?
Carrie Marshall.
Oh, hi, Carrie. Yes. Hi, Carrie.
Hi.
Yeah.
I'm from Horton, Louisiana. That's next door there to Mendon. And I remember the time when Dartois and the demonstration at Booker T. Washington, and that he was a police officer like Bull Connor, where he had the reputation. He had arrested his mother. I don't know whether it was true or not, but that was the reputation that went with him. So yeah, those were terrible times.
Thank you, Carrie, for sharing. Any other questions or thoughts? You can feel free to put them in the chat as well.
Charlie?
Absolutely. Hey, Lawrence, go ahead.
Hey, yeah. Captain Stewart?
Yes, sir.
Captain Stewart? Yeah, welcome aboard, sir.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to make a comment, I guess, more than anything. I guess we're sort of close contemporaries in a way. I had a very, very brief career in the Navy, and I'm not gonna go into details because it wasn't exactly a pleasant time. I also went to officer candidate school, and I was just so amused by your stories about your classroom experience, because I think the worst course I've ever been in my life, and I've got 4 degrees, but the worst course I think I've ever had to endure was celestial navigation, and I had nobody to pull me out of the deep. And so I suffered through that course. But I really appreciate all the remarks that you made. There was so much familiarity with a lot of the things that you said. And I was there about the same time that you were, maybe a little bit little bit earlier. I'm not real sure. I was there in 70, 69,
Okay.
70.
Yeah, I was commissioned in May or June of 70.
Okay. Well, you probably went through a little bit earlier than I did, but boy, what an experience that was. That whole, and we had, I don't know about, do you remember the Vietnamese officer candidates?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Those guys, I'm just doing some trivia with everybody. I hope people don't mind too much. But that was, of course, a time that the United States was Vietnamizing the war, and we were pulling out all of our forces gradually from Vietnam, and we were training our officer candidates to train the Vietnamese officer candidates, which I thought was kind of an interesting experience because those guys were so little, but it was funny to see them out playing on the soccer field with the Americans. They ran. Excuse me, I've got a cold. They ran circles around all of the American officer candidates and made them look really kind of stupid. I mean, it was quite an experience, but it was, as I look back on it, and I was honorably discharged, but I left early. I had a high draft number, by the way. Mine was 228, and I was safe. But anyhow, what an experience that was. And I personally enjoyed your stories about the Navy and admire very much the way that you handle difficult situations. And, it's just a grand thing that you've accomplished in life. And I commend you, sir.
Thank you. I had a great experience. I had a lot of help, a lot of people come to my assistance, and I really didn't have a chance to say a whole lot about my career with Verizon, but I think I saw Kathy Palter on. Kathy was a godsend. She just took me by the hand and helped convert me from a military lawyer to a civilian lawyer. And I've just had so many people just come forward and lend assistance without asking, and so that's great.
Oh, what a wonderful thing! Well, I've enjoyed your excuse me your story very much, and I hope you come back again sometime.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lawrence.
Sure.
Any other thoughts or comments before we transition out?
Hello, Richard. Richard, this is Charles Sias.
Hey, Charles.
Richard and I, we're fraternity brothers in the greatest fraternity in the universe. And anyway, Richard and I met in the DC area while his tour went through the DC area. And also, Richard, as you know, I'm from Mississippi, so many of your stories, I certainly can relate to them. And it's great that you were able to overcome many of these adverse situations and reach the pinnacle that you aspire to do. Also, it's great that our wives have always been close, and also we were church members while you were in the DC area. And by the way, you exemplified all your leadership skills in our church, and we certainly appreciate all that you did there. But anyway, great job you did, Richard. I appreciated all your comments.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you very much. All right. So we do have 6:43. You all will receive an email from me providing you with more information about Project Unity and how you can engage in our Together We Can, our Together We Dine program, and even our vaccine program, and how to just get on our distribution list to directly receive these opportunities directly. So if you all would please, if there are no other questions or comments, we will capture them in the chat and share them with Captain Stewart. So if you want to drop something in the chat real quick, please feel free to do so. But at this time, I want to thank you all for joining us and being with us tonight. Let's give Mr. Captain Richard Stewart a Zoom round of applause for spending his time with us. We want to thank him. We want to thank you all for being with us tonight. And please stay safe during the holiday season. Booster up if you're not. Project Unity, we're in the community providing boosters and first, second doses and starting with kiddos soon. But just stay safe, take care of each other, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.